Hello and welcome to a talk in Garage Screen. It's not a film tonight. We have live action. Thank you very much for coming. And I apologise, but you actually have 3 British people speaking at you tonight. It was unintentional that it would be 3 British people. But so I apologise for the fact that you won't be getting things directly in Russian. So it is my great pleasure and privilege to be on the stage with David Adjaye and Zoë Ryan. And so what I would like to do is introduce them briefly, and then we're going to have a conversation. And we've cheated. There are 7 questions that I've already told them I'm going to ask, so they had some time to think about it.
But I never read them, so it's fine.
And then we'll go into more of a loose conversation. And then we will ask you if you have any questions. So keep things in mind. If there's anything that you can't understand, if the translation isn't working, then please let us know, because it's pointless having a conversation that you can't get. So, Sir David Adjaye describes himself as a storyteller more than he does an architect, but he's a storyteller that uses concrete and steel as words and other materials. Other people have described him as one of the visionary architects of our time. In January this year, the Queen of England, Her Majesty the Queen, decided that she would knight him, so that's when he became a Sir. And in April this year, Time magazine said that he was one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and he was the only architect that was given that kudos. So this is David's moment. This year is a good one, and last year was a pretty good one as well. He started Adjaye Associates, so he initiated the company in 2000, and since then he's made over 50 buildings, which is an incredible number over the time. And as you know, Skolkovo is his largest project to date, and we're very proud that it's in Moscow. He produced that in 2010. Zoë Ryan she has an interesting title. She's a chair and a curator, but she's actually a person. She's the chair and curator of architecture and design at the Art Institute of Chicago. And there she works with fashion, with design, but with graphic design, with product design, with furniture design, also with architecture. So it's a very interesting position. I think it's the first person that's been given that position at the Art Institute. In 2014, she was the curator of the Istanbul Design Biennial. So it's this large-scale project that happened across Istanbul. And that was also the year that I think she got working in earnest on the exhibition that she has co-curated with Okri N Resort of David Adjaye's work. So it's the biggest show, I think, in terms of one architect. So it was interesting when I was looking into Zoe's biography. There's an article that says the things that she thinks is important to be a curator, or what a curator needs to do. So she says that to be a curator, you need to listen carefully, you need to research, you need to soak up everything, you need to maintain a critical eye, and you need to build teams with people that you do know and people that you don't know. So I thought that was interesting to hear the way that Zoe thinks about working with people. So now I'm going to start by asking David some questions, and then once Zoe has got completely bored, waiting on the edge, I will move on to Zoe and talk more together. But first, I thought it was interesting to ask David some basic questions. So you're somebody who was quite involved with art early on. You didn't go straight into architecture. So what made you decide that you wanted to focus and become an architect?
Thank you. Thank you for making this show come here. It's, for me, almost a decade after completing that building in Skolkovo. It's really incredible to be back in the city. I think it's got too much feedback on this. Architecture for me, when I was at that age where I was choosing what I wanted to do in my career, was very polemical. It was very much a style war. It was, if you remember that time, it was that moment where people like Daniel Libeskind and Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas actually hadn't built buildings yet, but were very much in a very big theoretical discussion about what architecture should do. And it for me, really split into two realms, deconstruction and postmodernism. And people forget that time, but it was a very rife debate between tearing up history and reconstructing through history. At that time, I was becoming interested in architecture. I came to architecture late. I was not one of those that wanted to do architecture as a little boy or anything like that, contrary. But I listened to the debate, but didn't find any of it kind of engaging with the kind of reality of for me, this society that was kind of coming to the end of the 20th century and kind of on the brink of a kind of new revolution. The internet was really a kind of discussion in my generation, kind of looking forward to it, hearing about it, etc. And I found at that time that actually artists were much more engaged with the realities on the ground. And I started to go to lectures at art schools and the foundation I did, I kind of came into connection with a group of artists that I started to watch and become friends with, and sort of looked at how they approach critical inquiry in society. And I just gravitated immediately towards them. So, and why was that? I felt that they were dealing with the difficulty of making form in our time without the baggage of history. Clearly they had a historical perspective, but they were so animated about how to think about phenomenology, how to think about matter, how to think about time, how to think about all those things that were really complicated about the late 20th century with all these technologies and all these industries and all this population explosion and advances that were happening. And I felt that I wanted to grapple with those. And so it gave me a lens to kind of have a critical inquiry. I wasn't interested in architecture simply as a building act, but really as a critical lens to engage with society.
That leads nicely into the next question that you don't know is coming. So David grew up living in a number of places, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe before his family settled in London. And when you start looking into the way that David talks about his practice or what other people say about his practice, it's often said that experience of living in different places, of experiencing different cultural and urban environments was very influential to the way that you thought about architecture. Can you say how and why that was? Why is it that being in different places has influenced the way that you make a building?
Yeah. I mean, it can sound very sort of a little bit silly, just saying that you go to different places, but actually, I think that when you're young, your senses, your haptic kind of sensorial world is very strong. You're absorbing through context and learning through context and relationships. And I think that what was sort of interesting in the way my father chose the trajectory, whether he chose it or whether it just happened, was that we went from the equator to the south of the equator and then right up to the north of the equator. So in a way, geographically, we went from probably one of the most extreme sort of places on the planet in terms of proximity to light and heat and humidity. South of that, sort of seeing a kind of more temperate sort of landscape, and then rising through deserts into Europe, the more kind of northern climates. So before I was 10 years old, I'd experienced a kind of slice of the geography of the planet, and I thought that that was normal and everybody knew that. And I kind of realized that when I kind of arrived in England and at school, that actually that wasn't very common. So I realized that people actually lived in the same place their whole life. And that was like a completely new shock. As a child, you just assume that what you do is what everybody else is doing. And I think that really settled in a kind of programming and an attitude to the way in which globalization and the metropolitan condition of the city could be understood. So when I encountered a place like London, which is very much a kind of metropolitan city almost from its origins, I was immediately struck by, wow, the people from the desert are here, and the people from these places are here, all these cultural sort of tropes are all kind of intermingling in this context. And I became really fascinated by that sort of context as a way to really try to make sense of how different perspectives and different cultural kind of readings and different peoples were kind of all together in this one place. And I think that somewhere like London has always actually, unlike Paris or something like that, which is more singular, London has actually been quite an eclectic city. When you really read it, it is a kind of European city, but it's also a very eclectic city in terms of its influences and the way in which it's brought different things to use, because it's very much an opportunistic city. It's a city that was always struggling to kind of make sense of why it was there, and then it sort of took advantage of a lot of strategic things to kind of make what it is. And in a way, that...
It's also the colonial aspect of it, isn't it?
It's completely. Also, the kind of the British Empire, the sort of one of the last empires, sort of really had a kind of relationship where the colonization of the empires also created a relationship back to the center in a way that it didn't happen in other empires, in a very specific way. I mean, it happens always in empires, but it happened in a kind of very precise way where the kind of geographic expanse of the British Empire created a new kind of metropolitan condition where you had people from Southeast Asia, from the Americas, from Africa, all coming back to this center and creating a kind of a new hyper kind of metropolitan, really. And I think that was powerful for me as a young kid growing up, and also powerful in the sense that I saw a city absorb and learn so much to create its identity. And that became very inspiring.
And of course, because you ended up training in London and setting up Adjaye Associates first in London, although you have 2 or 3 offices now. 2. But basically, one of the things that I think is interesting about the way that your career developed is that you start off by doing private commissions for artists, but then quite quickly, within a few years, you start with public buildings. But from that stage and moving forward, you've often talked about the social responsibility of architecture. And this seems to kind of follow through from your observation of the kind of metropolitan landscape. And so can you talk a bit about what you really mean when you talk about social responsibility? Because a building in itself can't be socially responsible, obviously, because it can't talk or care.
It'd be kind of amazing if it could. Yeah, that's the technology somebody should invent.
The caring building.
The caring building that tells you it cares. No, when I say that architects have a kind of social responsibility, unlike a product designer in society, architecture kind of prototypes in real time and in society. So if the thing is a, F up, if it's a fuck up, it's really something that everybody is kind of, that mistake is something that happens with everybody around it, also going through it and kind of experiencing it. And what I mean by that is that the form, architecture is always in the prototype stage. It's always creating prototypes and hoping that there are enough lessons in this great 10,000-year history of city making to get it right or to get close to getting it right. And I think that responsibility of that weight of history, but also that responsibility of being given large sums of money to create form which concretizes ideas in society, because like it or hate it, construction for me is like I always talk about them being narratives, but they really like biographies of our time. I think every time a building is built, it's almost like a novel. You can be like a detective. If somebody came back from time, they could unpick that building and understand a lot about the context that we're in through what materials, what choices, what forms, everything kind of actually gives you the forensics. And that's what we do in archaeology. Archaeology is literally looking at bricks and mortar on the ground, and we can tell narratives of whole civilizations from a few rubbles on the ground. So for me, there's a kind of incredible responsibility in that and that biographical quality. And that then for me says that because it's a public art, I mean, architecture, even when it's private, is still public, because you just have to, somebody walks past it, even if they don't want to, it's in a street, etc. There lies in the public realm and the social realm of architecture, that there's a kind of responsibility, not just to the program and the client and the form, but there's a counter responsibility, especially when it's a capital project or a project for profit, to almost work as two sides, on both sides of the line, as it were. You're working for the client to maximize their opportunity, but you're also working against the client because you're working for the public to maximize their opportunity. You're a double agent, in a way.
The architect as storytelling double agent. So to take this a little bit further, one of the things, when you see the exhibition, there's a couple of sections that focus very much on the research that David and his associates in the studio do. And it's something that I know has been very important to you from the beginning. So, for example, just to tell you, David started in 1999 developing research into pretty much all the capital cities across the continent of Africa. And it took 11 years to visit all of them, and he documented them himself. So you'll see that in the exhibition, all the various images. Then in 2008, he started a project called Europolis, which is looking at all the capital cities of the European Union. And this was quite different. It was a mapping project where he created this Europolis place with his colleagues that basically was a way of connecting up the cities in a different way by looking at the infrastructure that exists in these different cities. So the roads, the train lines, the waterways, like looking at all this information across the board and trying to understand these places in different ways. And then for Moscow, David has worked with March, the Moscow School of Architecture, and developed a project that's called Asiapolis. And it's looking at all the capitals of the former Soviet republics, as well as 12 key industrial cities across Russia at the time of the Soviet Union, making a similar mapping project, but looking at something that has really not been looked at all here. So I know with March, they were very excited about developing this project and looking into these infrastructures and how they were being developed during the Soviet Union and what's now missing. So Yerevan, you'll see, is basically missing any infrastructure at the moment. So there's a lot of comments that could come out of this research. So David, this kind of research is not, looking at your favorite buildings or doing surveys into ways in which other architects have worked, or maybe philosophies that connect into the way that many architects actually start research projects. So why do you look so broadly and in such a big way? I mean, it's a huge undertaking as well as building buildings. So why?
It's been a complete fascination from day one that the way in which I practice architecture operates within scales, and that making buildings is just one component of the practice. For me, I in my own mind's eye, I'm working across scales which are dealing with the built environment and how we construct the artifice of the built environment. So at this moment, I'm lucky enough to be able to make buildings within cities and in cities in different geographies around the world. And with that sort of background that I had, I always was very interested in this, especially in the kind of globalized world where, jet travel is normal, the ability to move around the world is seamless except for finances and border control, but it's pretty much very easy. Yeah. I was very interested in this notion of looking at architecture not as a global practice, because a lot of people use that word global, but globalism is really an economic term. It's not a human-based term, it's an abstraction. And I'm very much interested in the kind of physical phenomenology of the planet and a kind of memory of the planet as a kind of a way to think about architecture. So I kind of became very interested in what I'm calling a planetary strategy. And I love the word planet because it sounds so sci-fi and so kind of out there, but actually that's what it is. We are living on a planet, not on a global ball. And that this idea of a planet which produces geographies to do with its kind of evolution is really fascinating. And that if one could return, even in hyper-urbanization, an awareness, a kind of awareness, first even within architects, because actually architects say, yeah, we always think about place, and actually never do. It's just really kind of systematically sort of, we'll do a study of the environment. Okay, it's rainy, it's cloudy, blah, blah, blah. But I really mean like the kind of terra firma, the geology, the kind of roots of the kind of place on the planet. Because I think that it's about the kind of planetary time and understanding what that is. And then the narrative of the 10,000 years of city building as a kind of way to think about human stories. And when I'm talking about this, I don't need you to I don't mean like it's a kind of, like anything more than just a kind of consciousness of what the specifics are, what geological plates are here, what forces are actually operating, what is the narrative of habitation in this place, what are the kind of moments of kind of great moments of the civilization that might be here, and what is it now, and how is it constructing itself? I think that because there's so much information, I always think that architecture can be produced as a result of rather than as a kind of an act instead of. Do you know what I mean? It's a result of rather than an act instead of.
Do it through the awareness of what's already...
Yes. It's almost like waking up rather than actually acting. I think a lot of architecture for me is very sleepy. It just kind of does stuff. And it says, well, the client asked for it, and da la 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 la. And it's almost like the justification is through the asking. And actually the idea of making architecture is much more, I think, sacred than that. It's a kind of profound kind of moment where you make a kind of contract with society and a contract with the land. And so what do you do with that? And how do you do that? And, that sounds kind of hippie, but it doesn't have to be, it's a contemporary thinking for me, Yeah.
So just one quick question based on, for more detail, with Asiapolis, for example, which you'll see at the beginning of the exhibition, it's created a new shape. Yeah. It's almost like another kind of cartography.
Correct.
Why did you want to do that?
So important. With Africa, I was interested in producing the biggest archive of ordinary images of the continent. Up to the end of the 20th century, literally there did not exist a catalogue anywhere of images of the continent of Africa as a built environment. No, there is, and there still doesn't exist one. My book is the first book that catalogues the entire continent in terms of its ordinary vernacular built form. The production was always the highlights and the landscapes and where animals are. And, what it systematically did was to build within the mind's eye of people that Africa was a kind of landscape with sort of people wearing funny costumes and, and not much else. Or if they weren't, they were like in the bush somewhere. Of course, there is hyper-rural culture, but there's also hyper-modern culture. And I was so exhausted with having to explain that through my own upbringing, telling people, well, I came from cities, and they were like, what, in Africa? Like, what are you talking about? And I'll be like, Jesus Christ, So in a way, it was a way to monumentally answer that, but also a way, in my mind, more specifically, to also catch a moment before the next wave of industrialization, which is happening. I also wanted to capture, I felt like I was living in this time where I was lucky enough to see one century out and another century grow. So I wanted to capture the continent at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st as a kind of work. So if that was about the production of a lot of images, the work that I'm doing on continents, and it's ongoing, is really to imagine the territory between the fiction of a city and the reality of the city. And what I wanted to do was to produce a set of works that didn't have images, because actually normal cities have too many images. And in fact, we consume the cities through what we call heroic shots of it. Like there's the Eiffel Tower, or there's Big Ben, and there's these collages of images, and we construct the idea of the city through these fictional kind of moments which have been constructed and forget everything else. So actually we don't look at the city, we look at its kind of stereotypes. And I wanted to work against that by constructing the notion of the city through the infrastructure And the infrastructure, in a way, tells you the territory and expanse of the city. It tells you the dimension, it tells you the kind of purpose, it tells you the essence and the grain, and it tells you the texture of the city without actually seeing the images of buildings. So if you start to look at what infrastructure maps are, waterways, rail systems, you can actually understand exactly how a city is and how it grows. And so Europolis was that first test, and I wanted to kind of show the boundary of what Europe sees as its mind's eye, which is this large territory, and then the compression of the 29 city-states, they're like city-states practically, cities of Europe as one country. And it fit into the whole of Brussels. The whole of Europe as a collection of cities, every major city fits into Brussels. Which I thought was hilarious. It doesn't sound real. We actually made a kind of prediction from that analysis and kind of modeled what the size of all the cities of the world might be if you put it all together.
Just based on the infrastructure
Just
of the city.
on the infrastructure. And we realized that you could put the entire world into the state of Colorado. So there's something for your mind. The entire world can actually, if you linked all the infrastructure together, including all the parks that are constructed, would fit into the state of Colorado. That's a city, that's a space for 7 to 8 billion people. So we talk about things in the world, but actually we project pictures. We don't deal with the realities. And I'm trying to, I kind of know the answer, but I'm unfolding the narrative of what the real profiles and what the real geometries of what the notion of the city is and the project. It's going to take another 10 years, but hopefully we'll prove it and then make the book.
I know we're very happy here to have put one of those steps in. I know that March was very excited about doing it. So
it was great to collaborate with March. They were incredible sort of students and practitioners. Yeah.
So Zoe, to put you out your misery, can you say how you met David? Because it's you and Okwi Enrizor who are the curators of the exhibition, but you obviously both have your own story.
Can you say why you wanted to do the show?
Yeah, maybe my reason for doing this exhibition is different to Okwi's, but maybe not. I met David, well, we can't really remember, but it was about 2005, 2006. And I was working in New York at a very small but feisty non-profit called the Van Allen Institute, which does all projects about improving the design of the public realm. So David is a key part of that. And I was fascinated by David's very first public buildings called idea stores, these libraries that he was working on in London. And I showed these two projects in an exhibition back then. And David and I just picked up a conversation and kind of ran with it. And in 2011, I have distinct memories of a lunch in Miami. It was very, we're very un-Miami, the both of us, so you will remember this. David had won Designer of the Year, I think, at Design Miami. And we got together to kind of celebrate this and started talking then about an exhibition. And why it became sort of, I think, more current was the fact that David, I think, had just won or was, sort of in the thick of winning the project for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And of course, for us in the States, this was an enormous hook for doing a show with David. A project, the first, real bona fide museums, on the one hand memorializing but also celebrating the African American experience on the Washington Mall. I felt that in a city like Chicago, probably one of the most segregated cities in America, suffering terrible gun violence right now, that this was an amazing moment to talk about really challenging issues about race and culture and identity, and to celebrate this project in DC. So we kind of planned for it as close as we could get to the opening. We were within the year when we opened the show at the Art Institute. And I think about the same time David was talking with Okwi, I mean, they're very good friends too, and sort of mentioned that he was also interested. Okwi is the director of the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and a real authority, I would say, on African-American arts, African arts, just the international arts, contemporary art in general. I mean, a enormous brain to bring to the table. So I was very excited to work with him, of course, very excited to work with David. And I think also to bring kind of art and architecture together in this project. So many, many conversations later, many trips to David's studio in London and New York, and to see projects around the world, we kind of started developing the project together. I think, can I just say one thing about why I wanted to do a show? And I think Oakley had the same ideas. I think we really wanted to give David's work some critical perspective. We wanted to try and frame it more than we felt that it'd been framed in the past. And we felt that we wanted to unpack it. And it was quite interesting. You know, even though by the time that we started working on this project, you know, David had, by then, 50 projects either built or, you know, to be built. I mean, this is an extraordinary amount of work for a guy that is just turned 50, not that long ago. You know, people are just beginning to get in their stride, typically in architecture. But what was interesting is at the beginning of David's career, I think people found it quite difficult to get a beat on what David was doing, because he doesn't have a singular style. Each project was looking radically different to the next. People were like, where the hell is this guy going? And so we had this opportunity to kind of show and sort of try to unpack the work and show through a big enough body of work some of the threads that were connecting these projects. They might not look alike, but there was absolutely things that bound them together. So his interest in material explorations, the kind of circulation, you know, the very conscious circulation through his sort of the spatial emphasis in his projects, the kind of key critical look at the inside as well as the outside of his projects, that connection to public and private space, as David talked about, but also this idea that David's absolutely committed to kind of the social, the cultural, the political implications of his work. And by that I mean that he really thinks of architecture as a political act and as a social act, as he talked about. And I think for us, working on this project but within an art museum was also really important for us, for Oakley, for me, now it coming to Moscow, because the other side of David's work is he's always worked with artists. His first projects were with artists that you mentioned, but also David's projects, you know, they kind of act like artworks. They force you into relationship with them like works of art. You share the space with his buildings, and you can only really understand them by inhabiting them. So what's so fantastic, and the show looks amazing here, and thanks very much for bringing it to Moscow. I think what's so fantastic about that is obviously hopefully people can go and see Skolkovo, and you get to sort of experience a project in your own backyard and in a city that's, you know, Moscow and Russia has always been committed to very progressive, visionary thinking, bold thinking. I mean, Skolkovo is nothing but a very bold vision for Moscow. But I think it was very important for us to do a project that would try and talk about some of these extraordinarily complex and challenging ideas, and also very relevant ideas. You know, the kind of landscape in which we're working in now is very complex politically and socially, and David's projects enable us to sort of have an entry point to talking about very difficult issues, but how architecture can really hopefully be an agent for some change.
So, at Garage, this is the first exhibition that we've done. We've done exhibitions on architecture. We opened Sugar Bound with temporary structures, thinking through architecture, but this is the first time we've done a kind of survey of an architect rather than an artist. And one of the reasons is because making shows about architecture is difficult. Basically, I've always been nervous about architecture shows because of the fact that, as Zoe just said, the way that you experience an architect's work is by being in the building, by seeing it from the outside, by seeing how it does kind of muddle or contradict or support what's around it. And so when you make an exhibition of it, it's always kind of removed. The experience of light in the building, or, you know, all the different issues that David and Zoe have now talked about. So the idea of putting models together and having images, it's like, how do you get the feel of what an architect is really doing? It's very different to presenting an artist's work. So I want to ask both of you, how did the conversation start? Because of course both of you are aware of the fact that architecture is a hard thing to make an exhibition of. But what were some of the ideas that you had? How did you want to kind of avoid the difficulties of making an exhibition? And if you would, where did you disagree on some of the points or the ways that you wanted to approach it?
I wanted to make it really neat, and Zoe and Oki wanted to make it really messy. That's basically the bottom line. No, but if I can summarize it like that. No, a couple of things. In the show, something to notice, which was part of the original genesis, but actually here it's completely complete, because we couldn't do it with Skolkovo in the original show, was that every model is at 1 to 50. So every building in the show is in scale to the next building. So in a way, what you're looking at in the show is a kind of city, where from the smallest house right through to the Skolkovo, you're really seeing the real scales of the buildings next to each other. And I think that that was something that was very important to do, is just to make one statement like that there's this idea of a kind of, you're able to see how a couple living in a small little, like the Electra house, and how Skolkovo operates as a kind of city on its own within a kind of context. That was kind of powerful. And that we would try to be more honest about the references. You know, when Zoe and Okwi came to my studio, in the different project sort of spaces, all the references and all the thinkings are on these, what I call the war room kind of walls, where we just pin things up that are critical and informing or working on the projects. And I remember them saying, we just want to do that. I was like, no, that's my secrets, that's what I do, that's what I work internally with. But they were like, no, this is for us really taking the studio and bringing it to the gallery, right? Mm-hmm. You want to say something?
No, absolutely. I would like to first start by saying, though, everybody says shows about architecture are hard. And shows about conceptual art are no less hard. And I think people forget, I think when they come to shows of conceptual art, they think, okay, they start to, okay, I'm going to build on my toolbox of knowledge about our history. I'm going to try very hard to understand what's happening. And somehow, people, when they go to architecture exhibitions, suddenly lose all their confidence and don't know what they're looking at. And I would urge people to be confident. And you are all, we're all architecture critics at the end of the day. We all have an experience of what it's like to be in a building. And architectural drawings are hard. I mean, I remember having to learn how to read them. I didn't train to be an architect. So I think one of the things that we were, the sort of starting point for the conversation was that we wanted it to be multisensory. We wanted to have diversity of scales. So with that in mind, we wanted to have, for the sort of diehard architects, the drawings, the plans, you can get into the real meat of a project. And then for others that potentially this could be their first entry point into architecture, there's films that we commissioned, which have been very important. Oliver Hart's film, which is people talking about working with David and what it's like to work with an architect, or myself and Okwi talking about what it's like to work with an architect in a kind of curatorial way, or how we think about his projects. And of course there's the models, and the process is really important. We did want to bridge the idea of when you go to David's studio, it's amazing that you get to see quickly, in a quick kind of overview, the things he's looking at, the stage of projects in, the kind of art that he's looking at, the historical references. The idea, I think, that David is committed to his projects being specific to place that he talked about, and what that means. How do you create something that is, on the one hand, very specific to the context in which it's made, but has enough universal reference points that a really diverse audience is going to engage with that, and it becomes an international project, not just a kind of local kind of parochial project. So he was very generous. Not all architects will allow us to do this, but he was very generous in kind of opening up the behind the scenes a little bit and giving you those reference points. And I think what's interesting about that is it's not that David is cutting and pasting ideas, or is he directly referencing things. You don't look at an artwork and think, oh, I see that in David's, buildings, but you see an essence of an approach, a methodology, and I think that was important for us. What does it mean to take a project from concept to realization? It's a long process to make architecture. And I think the other thing
just to clarify, when you see the exhibition, this research is all around the walls.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the models, you can then turn around, and in quite close proximity, there are images. Some of them are studies, and some of them are actual photos of the buildings. So that's the material, isn't it?
And you see also images of people in the projects. Typically architecture is devoid of humans. Architects love to take pictures of their buildings without any human presence, which is kind of ridiculous because then you can't see how a space is used. And I think it's nice that we have snaps of people really accessing and sort of animating David's work. So I think kind of the multi-sensory, the multi-layered, the messiness that David was so appalled by when we first perhaps suggested it was very important. But I also think the conversation was so rich, the dialogue was so rich, like you would have with any kind of show, and all the way through. And of course, Oakley brought his vision as an art curator. He wanted it to feel much more installation-based. I was really excited by that because I was looking for, new ways of thinking about architecture and design exhibitions. And then, of course, for me, I was on the sort of side of the architects and designers, wanting to make sure that, we had enough for them too, that they could really understand the project in real depth. So I think the joy was just the kind of the conversation, and I'm sure there were spats along the way, and but there wasn't.
We've forgotten them. They're just only
but
good
there always
memories.
is. The best projects are those where you do have intense conversations. But I think sometimes the intensity was actually about trying to understand a project and what it meant, and also over time, because we were showing projects from the beginning of David's career that have had many lives. That the libraries, the idea stores. It was amazing to go back and see those. I can't really remember, 10 years later, and see how they've weathered, how people are really using the buildings. Do they work? Don't they work? What things are happening in them? And I think that's the pleasure of doing a survey. I think at this stage it was the right moment to be able to sort of show David's projects and how they're kind of unfolding. And a little bit of where he's headed. Every third day there's a new project, so goodness knows where David's headed, but up, it's always up.
There's one of the models in the exhibition is of Latvia. There's a museum that will take about 2 years, I think, to be finished, but it's the first time that model has actually been shown. So the exhibition is also kind of shifting and changing each time it's presented, because that way it kind of keeps its updatedness and keeps it interesting, I think, for David as well. When he arrived, he was very excited to see that model, and the Skolkovo one, because it's a new model as well. So we need to talk a bit about Skolkovo, because you're here and it's here. And I think it would be good for audiences here. Maybe, I'm not sure which way you think it's most interesting to talk about it, but I know, how many of you have actually seen Skolkovo inside, or have you seen it on the inside? How many of you have seen it from the inside? Not many. So how many of you have seen it driving past?
Mostly.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk a bit about that, the kind of...
The drive-by and the experience. Okay, Skolkovo was really interesting because it was a competition. It was an international competition that the board wanted to make a new kind of education center. They had this incredible piece of land in that sort of part of the city that was zoned as a new technological sort of area for the city. And what was kind of striking to me when I came was, first I came and it was in the middle of winter, so it had 10-foot snow storms, practically disappearing as you went into the field. I was like, okay, I can't take a picture. I need to get back into the car. And then seeing it in the spring and realizing how beautiful that place was and how actually close it was to the center of the city and how it unfolded a very bucolic relationship. It's actually one of those threshold sites. I mean, it's becoming much more urbanized, but at that time, when we were starting, it felt like not quite suburb, but like this edge between the urban and the rural. Really very much edge in the rural and the urban, and not the suburb. That felt very powerful.
When did you start?
The competition was 2007. 2006, 2007. Yeah. And we won the competition because we basically made one premise, which we said that you would be crazy to build a learning center like every other model that we've seen, like a campus with follies, or as a kind of typical school, disaggregated. But we sort of made a presentation to the board and said, if you look at the history of kind of learning centers in Russia, but also of constructivism and all these kind of narratives, there was an incredible body of work which showed how one could make an architecture in this climate and in this culture that could really be something that was a kind of beacon that showed a different model to what you would see in the West or in the South or in the East, that it would be very much something to do with this place. And I was, that was a huge speculation because I was thinking these thoughts in my work, but they had really been only sort of made in Europe. And I hadn't actually kind of worked one at that scale. It was like a sort of 100-fold jump in scale for me. And you can see the idea stores were what I was doing in London. And then if you look at the model of Skolkovo and the model of the idea store, you can see the jump in scale that was kind of happening.
It's probably about 6 times.
Yeah, 6 or 7 times.
Bigger.
It's almost 10 times the size. So it was like an incredible scale jump. But I became really convinced that if you had 27 acres and you had a city that was very dense, for me Moscow was dense and very much a city of infrastructures, incredible roads, incredible sort of large systems and bodies, that if you had this 27 acres, was there a way to be generous about landscape? Rather than fill the site, which is what all the competition entry, all our competitors filled the site with lots of buildings. Yeah, everybody made a campus with a quad and a big avenue between it and 20 buildings, residential here and this school here and that school there. I basically made a diagram where I said you could do that and you would lose all this, or you could put it all together, almost like the Europolis project. You could put it all together and we could try to understand a new kind of relationship. And basically I said what you do is that you make a building which is 100 meters in diameter, and you release all this land, and that becomes the kind of inspiration, and also becomes the way in which the building becomes a kind of microcosm of that inspiration. And they bought it. They thought, this guy is somebody we want to work with. My first proposal wasn't even this proposal. It was, I actually made a building where I floated the entire building, almost like Tatlin's skyhook buildings, totally in the air, to sort of almost have this very kind of surreal relationship to the landscape, but everything was still in a bar building. It was just a bit too technically challenging at that time. So
especially because you said that you had to use concrete rather than steel.
It's amazing. So really, you think that the technologies are the same, but you realize that technology also is responding to kind of a context and a place. And the steel industry here was very expensive to use steel, and concrete was something that you would use here. But working from London, the kind of buildings that I was imagining, any engineer in London would say that's a steel building. And so just kind of understanding simple things like that and how to make foundations, an English engineer would want to do pile cores. The engineers here wanted to do very large raft slabs. Because of the mass of the building, they almost wanted to float it in the landscape because it's such a large plate. So there were these incredible nuances which were very much about how different geographies actually technically work, but how the image of things kind of have these kind of weird... and so that was fascinating. In the end, it's a concrete building, which doesn't look, you wouldn't think that that's a concrete building. And it's really a kind of a stratification. It's a kind of, the building itself is a geography. It sort of creates a kind of underbelly, which is a kind of service, arrival, infrastructure. Then it creates the 100-meter disc. And the 100-meter disc has 5 buildings inside it. So it's really like a building which is really not really, it's almost like an atmosphere that is created. And then it has the 4 buildings on top. So it's really a kind of game about playing with what you think the scale of buildings are and what you think form is. And very much the form on the outside, the buildings above, were very much meant to be buildings that you viewed from the street. I mean, it was kind of designed almost cinematically. The placement is environmental, but the composition created a kind of cinematic experience so that depending on how you drove to it, you had different perspectives of the building. And, yeah.
It's interesting though, because it's very un-landscape. It's almost this kind of high-tech, you know, with the colours, the gold and the blue and the...
It's actually a classic suprematist project, I would argue. Classic in the sense that it creates, it's the one spot where it dominates, it holds its position and it commands the view and it creates a kind of relationship to it, right? I mean, for me, that's the kind of ultimate suprematist text of form and space. But at the same time, it is also creating all these other narratives. It's not a pure suprematist sculpture. It also breaks itself down. It almost corrupts its own agenda. So, for instance, the facade is completely it's a pixelated drawing. It's the beginning of the computer being able to kind of create these systems so that you don't know the scale of the building. So actually, when you drive past it, it's almost a scaleless object. It could be 20 stories, or it could be 3. It's actually just 3 stories, the main bars. But people don't understand the scale as you drive by. And that was something that I wanted to play with. I wanted to play with the optics of not fully understanding the code of the building, because in a way, it was also the first building on that site, and I didn't want it to just become a kind of building that registered itself in a kind of monumental, sort of building-like way immediately. I wanted it to kind of ask questions. Yeah.
Well, maybe I always ask David this question, and he always rolls his eyes at me, but because I always think there's a good lot of students in the audience, I always like to ask him a question about, you know, advice that he would give them, but I kind of feel like I want to turn it on his head, because now he's had 3 opportunities to go back and look over his own body of work, which is always interesting. And I wonder, what advice would you have given your young self, looking back now that, you know, that your career is so established, and obviously the projects are growing in scope and scale? What would you have liked to have said to yourself? What have you learned?
That's the Back to the Future question, right? You know, I think that probably the best piece of advice I can give to a young architect coming up is that actually your wildest dreams and your pure thoughts, not your ego thoughts, but your pure thoughts are worth pursuing, in the sense that the kind of naivety of a young architect to just dare to sort of question things is so important. It's so important. And if I actually had the kind of knowledge that I have now, I would not have made those buildings. I actually would have been too scared to make those buildings. And in a way, not having enough knowledge allowed me to kind of be a little bit fearless about what I was intending, and to be arrogant enough to think that they were going to be the right things. But, you know, it's kind of funny. I mean, looking at the buildings now, when going back to Skolkovo, nearly 10 years, you know, there's additions, changes, you know, the gymnasium space is now an office space, etc. Things grow and change. But fundamentally, the diagram is still the same. And that, for me, is really, really powerful, that if a building's diagram can sustain itself through the life of a building, then I think that an architect has succeeded. Because for me, the building is not the sum of the details. Some people think it's about the details, but the details will change, and the kind of aesthetic will change, but the narrative of the building and what it communicates and what it does has to be the fundamental code in the building that has to stay. I always think that the building has to have a code, and that code has to be able to override all the kind of mutations that will happen to the building and still register back. Yeah.
I'd actually say that you're less interested in the details, maybe, than other architects, and more interested in the big picture.
It's such a dangerous thing to say.
I'm just going to say, warning, it's your turn next. So this conversation will go on, but start thinking about the questions that you want to ask.
We need a fire in here. Should we burn something? No, I am actually very interested in details, but not in the fetishization of details as a kind of end in itself. There is a kind of tendency, and it's actually quite back at the moment in Europe, there's very much a fashion right now for the fetishization of the detail as the building. Like, it's all about, you know, the brick moving 3 centimeters this way and the thickness, and, you know, and it's all interesting, it's really interesting, but it's kind of slightly sad for me because, in a way, when you kind of shrink to just looking at the micro scale of architecture, you forget, and it becomes just an artifice for you, you've almost lost the power of how it kind of engages in the world. It's almost, for me, the danger of it is that it decouples from society and it just becomes about taste and kind of the ability to just use valuable materials and to sort of impart a kind of weight through valuable things. And I'm really nervous about that. For me, the democratization of architecture, the democratization of design, is the ability to bring design to any level, to bring it to the level of the bus stop, to bring it to the level of the kiosk, and to have the rigor in each of those moments, from a palace to a kiosk, to have the same intellectual rigor. Because for me, if that isn't the pursuit of design, then we go back to a hierarchical, autocratic world of, like, you know, I mean, a kind of insanity, which I think you can imagine the Middle Ages were. You know, it's like, for me, it's important that architecture is democratized right down so that the person living in a very small micro apartment has the same value as the person living in a palace in terms of intellectual capacity. That there's a kind of intellectual dignity in the housing that's made with the mind as it is with the thing that's just carved tons of marble out of a quarry in Italy. You know, it doesn't matter because actually the intellectual capacity overrides the monetary value. It's important that architecture has that aspiration. Otherwise, we might as well just all give up and just turn the world into those who have and those who don't have. Yeah.
Well, maybe one question, because so Kate mentioned at the beginning that in 2014 I curated the Istanbul Design Biennial, and it was sort of on my part, a kind of selfish thing to do because I work in a huge museum. It's an encyclopedic museum, and I was getting a bit frightened that I was becoming institutionalized. And I wanted to do a project that was kind of much more messy and scrappy and could really kind of shake me up. So David, you know, when you start your career, there's so much drive and energy and enthusiasm, and I see it with all the kind of the new people and the young people in our office that kind of help me stay fresh and alive. So how do you kind of not stay naive, but how do you stay fresh, and are you able to have that kind of continued verve for not the new, but really kind of almost reinventing yourself each time when you do a project?
You know, some great people that I know always say that you've got to continually learn, that lifelong learning is a reality, that the minute you stop lifelong learning, you really shut yourself off from the world. And, you know, I mean, there's the horrible paradox of age is that it's continually distancing you from the world. As you become more comfortable and you become better, you sort of move further and further away from the world, and it's really like a paradox. So you have to sort of continually reboot yourself and re-engage yourself with things. It doesn't mean you go clubbing every night or anything like that. That doesn't mean getting into reality, but in a way, I think that the idea of the quest for information and the kind of the ability to understand how information is shaping the world is something as makers and as thinkers we have to be critically always engaged with. So I'm lucky enough to have, you know, great friends that I'm always in dialogue with, and I'm always engaged with, for me, what I think are forms and movements and ideas that are always changing the world. I don't just read them, I also try to go and engage with them and to try and find out what they mean. Because for me, every time I'm making a new building, I realize that I have to wrestle with the forces that are shifting the world. And maybe 10 years ago, I had a set of forces that I thought were real, but they may have disappeared. Like, you know, they literally may have just disappeared. And in fact, those forces that I thought I was resisting are no longer relevant. So if I just still stay kind of fighting that demon in my own mind's eye, I'm kind of making work that's just kind of about myself in a kind of weird glass bowl. Like looking up, it's totally somehow Oedipal almost. So for me, you have to continually come out of your comfort zone. And in my office, I always say that when you get a project, the first thing to do is not to draw. Like, I stop everyone drawing. And what we have is these research teams, which were very private for me before, but have now become public. And it's always about making conscious the information. And the idea of making conscious information is a way to force a kind of resistance to the act of authoring. Because I think that ultimately, actually, there's a kind of romance about authoring, which is somehow the 20th century fiction of Van Gogh, like cutting his ear off and the trauma. You know, poor Van Gogh to have that metaphor, because actually he really was a real, he was engaged and he was like in trouble, but that's a different kind of conversation. But this idea that somehow architecture is almost this kind of art of just making form is a complete fiction. I mean, the really powerful architecture of any age struggles and is messy with the time, because actually the force of architecture is against the forces of ideologies, or sometimes is kind of working in a kind of unison with them. And the struggle is to how to realize that into form. And the idea of making form through that struggle is such an important part of how I think great work happens. I mean, from my analysis, if you're not in that struggle, you're not making anything. You're just making sculpture, which is fine, it's very nice, but it kind of doesn't have epochal impact. Epochal impact happens through that struggle. So you've got to be prepared to have the struggle. Yeah. Go.
But my question is actually about Skolkovo, but also about the nature of eclecticism in general. Mm-hmm. I think Skolkovo, your project at Skolkovo is interesting because you combine Malevich with these patterns from Ghana, and the project of Skolkovo itself is like a confluence of like ideas from Russia as well as many ideas from the West. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a two-part question, but when you have a building, a built form that combines multiple cultures, what is it? And in this case, what is Skolkovo? Is Skolkovo Russian? Is it Western? Is it for the world? What is it?
Okay. A brilliant question. Thank you for asking it. I don't believe in national ideas. Because I think for me, national ideas are fictions. They're fictions to do with societal agglomerations. And the reason I specifically speak about my buildings through the lens of place and narrative is because that's what they are. My buildings are stories. They're basically stories. It's not Skolkovo, it's not Russian. It's about a story about a place here that has this kind of aspiration, but also has this incredible history. And it's about my encounter with that place and the translation of that into form.
So it's subjective? No. I mean, it's subjective in the sense that everything is subjective that's made through somebody, but it's objective in that it deals with concrete realities. It's not a fantasy. It is kind of not, it's not a fiction, it's agglomerated through the narrative of the place.
Another question?
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Architecture should not be a fantasy.
There's a question at the back there.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Frankly, I'm not an architect.
It's okay.
My profession is not
You're forgiven.
about art. Yeah. But I've been to Skolkovo. It's
great.
And one thing that when I was at home in the evening and I was thinking about, I was really inspired by it. I don't know why this building gave me this impression, but it's really amazing. Thank you. Thank you for this building.
Thank you.
And I'm really looking forward for the exhibition. I think it would be really amazing.
Thank you.
And as for my question, I'm just curious. Maybe you have one city, I don't know, our country, where would you build your new project? And if you have, what is it?
Okay. I think that hopefully what I'm trying to project when I talk about my work is that I try not to predict or to be in front of my creative tendency. I see my whole creative act is resisting my own creative tendency. Now, that sounds really weird, but it's kind of, as in I have a lot of creative tendency. So if I kind of just go off, I want to build things everywhere. everywhere.
Where's the last place you'd want to build? Because maybe that's where you'll end up building.
And let me just answer the question for you. For me, the responsibility of making architecture comes in the fact that I don't choose that, and then I have to engage in it. And I have to move out of my comfort zone to then engage in it, to then find form. Do you see what I mean? So I didn't choose Moscow because I've always wanted to work in Moscow. It was because that was the selection, that it was a project that came up, and I thought, we've never done that. Let's try it. We put in our thing, and then we were asked. And I work globally because I'm interested in, it's almost like a way to always continually challenge what I do. So I will work, like I'm being asked to work in very disparate parts of the planet, from deserts to kind of snow peaks. And for me, it's interesting because each time I have to rethink what it is I do and why I do it. And that is very powerful for me. So I try not to say my dream project is even, because if I know my dream project, it's not an interesting project for me. I want the project that I don't know yet. And I want to make the project that I haven't seen yet, because that's the project that's going to be interesting.
Thank you.
Another question? There's one there.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. I want to ask you where you to get the inspiration for a new project.
Say that again? What?
Inspiration for your project.
Oh, the inspiration?
Yes, for a new project. And what will it be?
For my new projects?
Yes.
Do you have one in mind that you're thinking of, or just generally?
Maybe tell about your new project. Do you have?
In Latvia?
Yes.
The Latvian project is really interesting because that was my first trip to the Balkans. So it was really about trying to understand this geography, which is this kind of extraordinary landscape of water and flat lands, but also super cold. And this incredible rural culture, but also this incredibly beautiful city that is like London in a strange way. It's 1,000 years old as well. Riga has a history back to 1,000 years, a kind of eclectic kind of language which runs all the way through it. And to see if I could make, and also then the idea of contemporary art spaces and what they are. What is the apparatus of making a non-collecting space or a collecting space or a bit of both? So the project is really a kind of meditation on that, if I can say. It's on that kind of notion of the geography and how the architecture of that geography manifests itself, the certain materiality, the way in which you make spaces for art, different kind of geometric scales and proportions, and a way in which you make a civic building in this city that has a very specific layering of topologies. So when you see the model, it's a shame is that when you see the model, it's almost like an object in itself, and maybe that's the conceit of my show, is that it almost presents the objects as though you should be in wonder. But I'm actually trying not to let you necessarily look at the model and think, oh, wow, it's a wonderful model. I'm hoping that the model makes you think, well, what's going on here and why? And then hopefully you go to the wall. And then you start to see the kind of narratives. And then hopefully between the model and the wall, you start to inquire about the place.
What's interesting about that model, though, is that it's got no colour on it.
Yes.
Because it's not finished yet. So it's a kind of blank slate at the moment, isn't it? So there'll be another model.
Because it's still evolving. It's still evolving.
Can we have the microphone down here?
Hello.
Hi.
I'd like to get back to the first question. You told that you don't believe in nationalities. If I get it right, you don't believe in nationalities in architecture. Yeah?
Well, I don't believe in nationalities in architecture for sure, but I generally don't believe in nationalities, period.
But I remember you told us, that globalization, it's about financial things, so
yes.
It's not about architecture. And also, you did a big research of architecture in Africa.
Yes.
Yeah. How it works together.
Yes.
I'd like to, maybe just difficult to translation for me,
Sure.
difficult to understand, but I can't combine these two things in my head.
Okay.
That you don't believe at nationalities, at the same you did this research and you said that you don't believe in globalization in perspective of architecture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. So with the Africa project, I started off by naming the 54 countries, and I ended by dividing the 54 countries into 6 geographies. So the book, if you look at the book, the analysis, I said that actually in the end, if you really wanted to make 54 national architectures, you'd be mad. But actually all there is are 6 geographies of architecture. So
it's like the desert.
There's basically the desert, the mountains, the savannas, the jungle, yeah, and the bits between. So in the end, I reduce architecture to geography and place. And I do that with everything I do. So for me, the problem is that the fiction of nationalism, and I do it as a kind of provocation, is that it makes you forget place. And place is not national. Place is the planet and the narratives of human beings that live there. Like divisions happen in societies that are constructions. I know, like just from my own family, that there are people who live in one country and another, but actually are the same people. But they say they're one country and another because of an invisible line that somebody constructed. So for me, yes, we need it for economic and social organization and sort of all these kind of crazy abstractions, but actually, we're just people living on land, whether with technology now or technology from the past. We're people that habit the land in basically 6 different geographies. All over the world is the same. The kind of Africa project is actually the project of the world because those 6 geographies are the only thing the planet produced. And then what I call sort of mutations of those things in concentration on other continents. So actually, if you're looking at it, what we've done for 10,000 years is to learn how to build on these 6 geographies with new technologies continually. And now we call ourselves Chinese, we call ourselves whatever. It's just the same stuff. And then we struggle for this idea of a kind of like almost football kind of uniform. And it always collapses for me, but because I mean, in the end, it's kind of an abstraction. And it's fine, I don't think it's a problem with it. I don't rile against it as a kind of, that it's a problem. I rile against it because I think it stops architects from really looking at the reality. People start to say it's London architecture or European architecture. And I'm like, well, really? It's Northern Hemisphere architecture, actually.
But maybe you can talk a little, Kate, maybe he can also talk a little bit. I mean, what's so interesting about the Africa project is that you're showing that it's multinational.
Completely.
Because you're all, I mean, one of David's arguments is that we're transnational because we're borrowing references. I mean, when you look at the Africa project in specifics, because you are documenting all kinds of buildings, from the vernacular to the highly sort of architecture with with architects we know. So you're documenting references in those projects that people from all over the world can read.
Can recognize,
because you can understand sort of a visual language that's not wedded to one place, I think.
The complexity of actually then looking at stuff is that you realize that even though it's the most unfashionable world in intellectual circles, we're all transnational. We all are kind of collages of different kind of cultural things that we absorb to kind of make our identities. And architecture does that too. You'll go to a house in the middle of London and you'll have an oriental room. Or then you'll go to another place and you'll have in a different country and you'll have a Gothic inspiration in the Middle East. I mean, it's like these things are how we construct the cultural narratives which are ourselves. And actually artists in the art world we are the best thieves. We creatively steal all the time. Like we steal, architects, artists, steal. That's what we do, let's admit it. We're always borrowing and stealing from sources that we think nobody knows. And that's what we do, and you reframe it. It's kind of the history of arts and architecture. So we are transnational. If we're going to use national constructions, we're transnational. I just don't even like using that because I just think that in the end, it's really about that. I reduce it even further past that. Yeah.
So your question?
Добрый день. Скажите, пожалуйста, побольше о Нацмузее в Вашингтоне.
Could you tell us more about National Museum in Washington?
Yes.
For example, did you have some limitations in terms of timeline or other restrictions, whether you were happy working on it or not? Thank you.
Okay, back to architecture. That was too much philosophy. The Smithsonian it's the fastest building the Smithsonian's ever built. Usually it takes 12 years to build a building on the mall because of the fact that it's a very interesting site. It belongs not just to DC, to the state, it belongs to the nation. So it's very much an abstraction. So the Washington Mall is the federal piece of land that belongs to the idea of America. So it has its own regulatory bodies that need to intervene to make a building. So we had to go through that. It took 3 years of just going through that process, which if it was a state project would have taken 6 months to a year to do. So it was super complicated from that point of view. And then the Smithsonian also has its own delivery mechanisms that's different from other situations. They have the Institute, and they have about 150 architects on their side. So we won the competition, and then we had to work with this Office of Smithsonian Architects to realize our project. So it's almost like we won the competition, thought, phew, we're done. And then we had to deal with the critiques of another body inside the body to kind of develop this project. So yes, it was very, very complicated. And then obviously it's a project that really is speaking about a group of people that are very important to understand what America is now. So it had this kind of historical kind of sort of construction that had to be addressed. So that was also a kind of profound challenge in terms of that negotiation. And in terms of building
very
it...
political with the end of Obama's...
In the end, I mean, I always talk to my students about how architecture and politics really are joined together, because we said, it's amazing we finished the building 1 year before the administration that's in power now, and we would never have probably finished the building if we were halfway through it, or we might not even have started, and that actually the agency of a political moment is critical to the construction of architecture with a capital A. Small architecture nobody seems to worry about, but architecture with a capital A seems to absolutely require political will. So it's almost impossible to construct architecture with a capital A without political will in some form or the other.
But come on, I mean, the site is
unbelievable. It's the most loaded site in
American the shadow
history.
Of the Washington Mall with, Jefferson's Memorial. I mean, you have the White House right next door. I mean, you couldn't get a better site.
No, it's one of the most powerful, loaded sites of the kind of 20th century. Yeah.
So there's a question just behind.
Здравствуйте. Большое спасибо за лекцию.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Во-первых, я хотел
First of all, I'd love to
окна верхнего света.
mention the top windows in Skolkovo. They reminded me of minimalism, Alvaro Siz. Very good joints, seamless joints. And I wanted to ask you this question. You've mentioned comfort zone several times. What is comfort zone, and how can you get there in order to come out of this comfort zone?
Спасибо.
Wow. Okay. What's with comfort zone? Yeah. Okay, there's two questions in there. There's the minimalism of the form. That was one part of the question, right?
Но это даже не... Это не вопрос про зону комфорта, про минимализм формы, это просто...
No, it was my comment. Really good top windows for the lights, skylights. But my question is about comfort zone.
Okay. I wanted to talk about minimalism, but all right, you stopped me. Comfort zone. Comfort zone, I meant doing things that you normally do, that you know very well. So, the practices that you have that are safe and understood. So, I mean, try to kind of push outside of that. That's all. Yeah. You have to, for me, moving out of that comfort zone forces you to think more critically and to ask more questions. That's all. Can we talk about minimalism?
Did that answer your question?
Да, давайте.
No? Yes? Oh, okay, great.
Ну, в принципе, да, спасибо. Ну, можно про минимализм еще чуть-чуть.
Say that again.
Вы ответили на... Ну, можно про минимализм еще, да.
So I mean, you can talk about the constructed minimalism of the building with this kind of abstraction. So in a way, the building has no detail, right? I think that's maybe what you're trying to... I hope, for me, the building has no detail. I spend all my time trying to make a building without a detail. And what I mean by that, and that is a kind of a minimalism, but it's not the minimalism of just reduction or sparseness. It's not about, a kind of faux zen kind of tranquility. It's about the idea that the kind of code of the building isn't being confused by the construction which puts it into certain categories. Yeah? So that's the kind of minimalism I'm sort of very interested in my work, and from day one. Oh, okay, so that's too complicated. Okay.
But it's a very complex term.
Right.
Sorry, I'm asking him to unpack that somewhat, because it's very complex. You're alluding to things. I think I know what you're alluding to.
Okay. So ask me questions and let me kind of get into it. So what I mean by that is, in a way, I think that all details locate themselves within specific times and languages and codes in architecture. When you design a door frame and you choose the architrave, it means something. When you design a window and you choose the ironmongery, it means something. All these things mean things. So when you are faced with making a building and you're using industrial components, and usually those components all have different evolutionary times, meaning that maybe the lift was developed in the 80s, or the wall cladding was developed in 2000, or the handles were developed in 1950. And you're bringing all these things together and you're trying to make a language. The problem with the industrialization of architecture, where everything is now about products, is that you have to find a way either to have somebody with a lot of money who allows you to design everything, like I'll just design everything, the door handle, everything, to make it completely contemporary. It's so rare to have a totally contemporary building, and when you do, it's really striking if you've ever been lucky enough to see one. What we're always faced with are these kind of agglomerations of time and systems. So one of the ways for me, I always try to deal with that in the building, to allow the building to present itself, to have presence, is to kind of reduce the detail, or to switch off the detail, so that the material presence of the project becomes the articulating nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, it's 9 o'clock, we're supposed to finish. There are too many questions now. So...
We're just warming up, it's really fun.
Exactly. All right, so we have...
All-nighter, 24 hours. We're going to do a hands-on bridge. We're going to do all night.
Hello. My name is Evgeny. One of the latest projects that I visited was Sugar Hill development in New York. What was the story about this huge mass building with a lot of details, and in that context?
Sugar Hill is really... Thank you. No, thank you for the question. Sorry, did I interrupt? Did you finish?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sugar Hill is probably the first time in all my work where another thing that I'm very fascinated in, really I got to play the other side of, meaning that most of the projects that you see in my work are public buildings. And for me, my kind of meta reading of public buildings is that they are the articulated nodes of any urban condition. So they have a certain responsibility to porosity, to openness, to a sort of democratization, to allow the greatest amount of the society to have access and relationship. And then there are these moments where I think, so in a way, when you look at my buildings, you maybe see too many of those and you think, oh, David just likes these kind of open, porous buildings. No, it's just because I'm working within that construction, which I now say is about that sort of narrative. But when I work in like the residential work, it's incredibly background and opaque. Because I'm interested in the notion that the city oscillates between opacity and porosity. And the residential part of the city, for me, is more monolithic, more respite, more refuge. And it's about an architecture that creates opacities to create kind of certain, what I'm calling, cave-like conditions. Caves and treetops. Yeah?
Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for the discussion. It's a great opportunity. And my question is, how do you correspond with your client? How do you prove your ideas? What the most effective? Is it drawings? Do you draw when you talk with the client? Or maybe a model, or maybe you talk? What about your team? Do they involve to this discussion with the client?
So in presentations, I'm ruthless. We use everything. For me, it's not a kind of sort of stylistic thing. It's about whatever communicates. Recently, we were even using VR to talk about a project with a client recently. So it's for us about what is the most effective tool to communicate to the client what the intention of the project is. So we're working at drawings, models, fragments, materials, three-dimensionals, animations, whatever we need to communicate. For instance, with Skolkovo, we actually presented our project in animation. We didn't do any drawings. We presented a film of it because we felt it was so dynamic we couldn't do it in images. It was too much. So we made a kind of movie for them. So whatever the medium is that will work is what we use. And my team is very much involved. I mean, I'm the team leader, but my team works. Anybody who knows my office knows that my teams really are they deliver the projects. I'm running around throughout the projects, but they are the ones who are constant and kind of deliver the project. So it's very collaborative.
I have just a short question about the museum, which, as I know, in the progress, it is a museum of the slavery.
No.
No?
Oh, which one?
Of the slavery. In Ghana.
Oh, in Ghana. Yeah. Yes.
You told about the struggling and about the idea which needs to be in the architecture. And in my opinion, it's very complicated to create the museum of the slavery. It's almost impossible. As I think, it's very difficult project. So maybe you could tell some words about the main idea and some assessment which you want to show in the architecture of this museum.
Well, it's still sadly not on site yet, but it's developing. But why is it so difficult? Because the subject matter is so heavy.
Well, the subject is complicated. I mean, it is very complicated to show maybe correctly the idea and to give the possibility to the visitor to have his own think about this problem. And I mean, anyway,
it's interesting. I think I get it. When I make a project, even the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I don't see my job as trying to correct something or make a judgment. I'm not interested in the moral kind of. I am interested in the morality of the project, but I'm not interested in making a moral judgment of the project. So I see my role as an architect is to reveal the information. So, and to kind of play through the information and to allow the visitor to then have the experience and to see it. And my role is to heighten each moment of those conditions to allow you to deal with the.
What are the main principles in this building?
History, architecture, people. She wants it.
Thank you.
I love it. Thank you. Zoe says the site's really important, especially in its relationship to the Smithsonian, of course. I mean, the reason why I'm interested in the project is because the Smithsonian really starts from the emancipation of African American slaves to present day. And this museum really talks about the moment from sort of that civilization in that area to the beginning of colonial slavery to that moment. So in a way, it is a bookend. But the buildings are not about bookends. The buildings, the project still follows the same project strategy that I always use. So for me, I think when the narrative is really powerful, the content can become powerful because there's so much information. You know, there are about 140 slave forts that were built between Senegal and Central Africa to extract 12 million slaves in 400 years, right? There's so much information that people just don't know. Most people have no idea what was going on. So there's so much for architecture and curatorial work to reveal that so that you can understand why the slave trade is traumatic, what it did, what it constructed, and how you can now have a kind of opinion within it with that information.
Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you to Zoe and to David. It's fantastic. It's such a great opportunity to hear you think out loud. So join me in the second round of applause and then I'll let David speak to a few of you and then whisk him off.
Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you.